The Books of Maccabees tell the dramatic story of the Chanukah revolt and the heroism of the Jewish fighters. But who wrote these books, and why were they left off the Jewish bookshelf? We'll discuss the history of these texts, explore their reception among Jews throughout the ages, and delve into the role they played, or didn't play, in shaping Jewish memory of the Chanukah story. The Sefer Aruch HaShulchan, which was written, a halacha sefer written by Rabbi Yechiel Michal Epstein. He passed away in the early 1900s. He was a Rav in Novardok in Russia. And in this Sefer Aruch HaShulchan, a rewritten Shulchan Aruch, essentially, he writes like this: V'oi tam lozeh, another reason for this. For this, meaning he's talking about over here why Chanukah is an 8-day holiday. Essentially, he's dealing here with the shaila known as the shaila of the Beis Yosef. The shaila of the Beis Yosef is if there was enough oil that they discovered in the oil, if it was sufficient to light for 1 day, so then the miracle is only 7 days, so why is Chanukah 8 days? This is known as the Beis Yosef shaila. Much has been said about this. So he's dealing with this, and he gives multiple answers. For example, one of the things he says, he accepts the idea, which the Beis Yosef proposed as a possibility, that in this small amount of oil, every day they used 1/8 of it. In which case, every single one of the 8 days was a miracle that so little of an oil lasted for the full period. And so therefore, that's one answer that he gives. A second answer that the Aruch HaShulchan gives is that the Yavanim banned the mitzvah of Milah. Milah we do on the 8th day, so in order to commemorate this, the fact that we overcame this ban, so the Yom Tov was instituted as being for 8 days. He gives another reason, which I'm not going to summarize now, and then he gives his fourth explanation for why Chanukah is an 8-day Yom Tov. Dr. Aruch HaShulchan Azoi, V'oi tam lezeh mevuar b'sefer Chashmonoi. Another reason is explained in Sefer Chashmonoi. What's Sefer Chashmonoi? That's exactly what we're gathered here today to discuss, and we're going to come back to that. What does it say in Sefer Chashmonoi? It says that because of the Greek decrees against the Jews, the Sukkos and Shmini Atzeres prior to the miracle of Chanukah is Kislev. So the Sukkos and Shmini Atzeres prior to that, they weren't able to access the Beis HaMikdash, or to be Makkah the Karbanos, or to do all the things that we normally do on Sukkos. In order to remember the fact that they didn't have this opportunity, and kind of also like to make up for the missed opportunity, Asu Shmini Yom and Chanukah, they said, let's recreate Sukkos. Sukkos is 7 days, with Shmini Atzeres is 8 days, and so therefore they make Chanukah an 8-day Yom Tov. Umemela, he continues, the Aruch HaShulchan, when they found this miracle, that oil which was supposed to last for 1 day lasted for 8 days, so essentially Hashem was showing them, that I agree with you, indeed it should be 8 days. They decided to make 8 days. Why? Because they wanted to recreate their missed Sukkos and Shmini Atzeres. But the fact that there was a miracle and oil lasted 8 days was a divine confirmation for this idea. This is what Rabbi Yechiel Michal Epstein, the author of Aruch HaShulchan, writes as his fourth explanation for why the Yom Tov is an 8-day Yom Tov. And again, where is it based on? It's based on an idea that's found where? In Sefer Chashmonoi. Sefer Chashmonoi is the place that says they wanted to recreate the Sukkos that they missed. What is the Sefer Chashmonoi? We'll put that question on hold and we'll come back to that. Rabbi Yechiel Michal Epstein is not the only posek to have quoted Sefer Chashmonoi. Let's go back a little bit to the 18th century, to the Yavitz, Rabbi Yaakov ben Tzvi. He passed away in 1776, and he has a halacha sefer known as Moiru K'tzia. It's written as a commentary on the Torah. Moiru K'tzia is some of the ingredients of the Ketores. So I'm not sure why he named the sefer that way, but Moiru K'tzia is 2 of those ingredients. And he writes there as follows. He's telling here on the Taz. The Taz is a commentator to the Shulchan Aruch, Reb David Halevi. And the Taz is dealing with the question of this minig that it says in Shulchan Aruch that women do not do malacha when the Chanukah candles are lit. Why is that? V'huz al hoisif, the Taz says, Loimar, sheneis Chanukah kamoy kei nasa al yedei anoshim. That's because the miracle of Chanukah happened, was brought about through women. Says the Yavitz about, and that's the reason that they don't do malacha. Says the Yavitz about this, v'zeh davar badui, which I think the correct translation is, this is nonsense. Even though the Yavitz demonstrates an awareness that what he calls Mefarshim have said this idea, that the miracle of Chanukah was brought by women. Who are these Mefarshim? He doesn't name them, but there's plenty of Rishonim that either alluded to this idea that the nace happened through a woman briefly, or said the story bekitzer about a woman who went to one of the generals and then decapitated the general, and the whole Maisa, which is known as the story of Yehudis b'derech klal. So Yavitz is aware that there are great Rishonim who quoted this story, but he still says v'zeh davar badui, that this is nonsense. The idea that this Chanukah is associated with such a story, he doesn't accept this. Why? There's no greater role that women played over men. Lo yamru Razal, because Chazal only said she'af hein hayu b'is anes. The Gemara in Shabbos Daf Chav Gimel says that af ein hayu b'is anes. What does it mean? They were also victims of the persecution of the Greeks, and therefore the miracle was also a miracle for them, which is why women are chayiv and neiris Chanukah. That's all Chazal say. Chazal didn't say she'al yedei isha hayahanes. Chazal said their lashon is she'af ein hayu b'is anes. This is what the Yavitz says. Rashi. So what does it mean that they were victims? So he brings from Rashi. That at a certain point, the Greeks made a decree that any married woman, Jewish woman who's marrying, has to go visit the Hegmon, the boss, the Greek boss. Hegmon is a Greek word. Has to visit him first. And what do you see from this is shegzeirusam that women were part, just like men suffered, women also suffered. That's all Afein Hoyu B'is Hanes means. But don't say that it means that a woman brought about the miracle. That's not that they brought along the miracle. Kenoida, he says. And how do I know? So first of all, he already says, because the Chazal, he was Madaik in the Lashon of Chazal. But then he says the other reason is because we know from the book of the wars of the Chashmonaim and from Yesifun. What Yesifun is, we'll deal with that. We'll come to that later. But right now, what do we see? We got our second hit. We have a Pesach over here who cites a sefer known as Milchamas HaChashmonaim, and presumably this is the same work that Rabbi Yechiel Michal Epstein is referring to. He called it Sefer Chashmonai. Yavitz is calling it Sefer Milchamas HaChashmonaim. And his point over there is that you read the book up and down, top to bottom, you're not going to find anything over there about a woman bringing about the nest. So, number one, Chazal just said, Af hein hoyu b'oisei hanes. Number two, you don't find any evidence for this idea in the book known as Sefer Milchamas HaChashmonaim and in the book known as Yosifon. And so therefore for him that's enough. And even though some great Rishonim actually did say that the story of Chanukah is associated with a woman Yehudis bringing about a miracle, and Ad Kadei Kach it's brought in Shulchan Aruch that the Ramah says is accustomed to eat milchiks on Chanukah to commemorate that miracle, so it's very well entrenched, this idea, in sources in Rishonim and Shulchan Aruch. The Yavitz doesn't like it for these two reasons, because of the Lashon of Chazal, number one, and number two, because Sefer Milchamas HaChashmonaim doesn't have this information. He continues and he says, Gam ha'paiton ha'ashkenazi b'yoytzer de Shabbos Chanukah, irbe b'maise shnei nisim ischalfen. In Nusach Ashkenaz, on Shabbos Chanukah, they say piyutim. The way in Chabad we say on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, they say on many of the Yomim Tovim and many of the special Shabbos, the special piyutim for the first Shabbos Chanukah, and there's special piyutim for the second Shabbos Chanukah if you have two in a certain year. So this is referring to the piyut of the first Shabbos Chanukah. That's the Yoitzer, which means it said Yoitzer v'rechesh aches shon varas hakol, and then right there they go into this piyut. What's the piyut? It's called Oitcha Ki Anafta. That's the name of this piyut. It was composed by a man named Yosef ben Shloima, who's one of the Rishonim, because Rashi already quotes this piyut. So at the very least, he lived in the 1000s. So this piyut over there retells the story of Chanukah. And for many Yidden, this was the public place where the story of Chanukah was recounted, was in this piyut, in the Yotzar. You came to Shul Shabbos Chanukah, and you heard a retelling of the story in the piyut, in the bracha of Yotzar. And basically he speaks about those exela against kashrus, those exela against Mila. He says the story of Chana and her 7 children with the Mesidus Nefesh over there. He goes on to talk about the revolt against the Maccabees, and then he says in the same piyut the story in one hemshech of Yehudis against the general named, he calls him Eli Farno. That's the name that he gives the general. And so what the Yavitz is saying is clearly he assumes this one story, it happened during Chanukah. Says the Yavitz, no, he missed up. Shnei Nisim mischalfim. V'rechoikim oid bizmaneim zemizeh. They're very distant in time. But like Karav said, there's no relationship between the two. Yavitz doesn't tell you how he knows, but he's saying the story of Yehudis is an earlier story, nothing to do with Chanukah. So it's an error, he thinks. Im Loisha Noimar, he says, maybe you can say Sharatza, that this Python wanted to give a memorial to the story of Yehudis that happened in an earlier time. When was the earlier time? They made Galus Bayis Rishon. So it happened after Churban Bayis Rishon, before the second Beis HaMikdash was built. That's where he places the story of Yehudis. Again, a little bit more about this in a few minutes. So we don't have a day to commemorate it. We should have a day to commemorate it. So this Python, they didn't really find a place where to put it. So V'tzirful L'neis Chanukah, they said, we're celebrating Chanukah, we might as well remember another miracle that doesn't have a day, and so they appended it onto Chanukah. If you use an example of a sad day, like Tisha B'Av, right? Tisha B'Av, what happens throughout history is multiple tragedies have been appended to the day. So here in the Sadat Tov, where multiple positive things were appended to the day of Chanukah. So this is the Yavitz's limud chos for what otherwise in his world is a mistake. Why is it a mistake? Because Chazal didn't say it in the words Af Heinoy Ba'is Hanes, but also because this book, Sefer Chashmonaim, gives no support to this idea that the miracle was brought about by a woman. So far, we have 2 poskim who cited the Sefer called Sefer Chashmonaim. Number 3, let's go back a little further in time. There was a posik who lived in Prague, and his name was Reb Elya Shapiro. Reb Elya Shapiro wrote a Sefer called Elya Zuta, and it's a commentary to the Levush, which is itself a halacha Sefer. He actually wrote 2 versions of it. One version is called Elya Zuta, one is called Elya Rabbah. He passed away in 1712, so again, we're moving back a little bit in time. So in the passage that we're going to read right now, there's going to be 3 or 4 names that we're going to be mentioning. The key that we're going to want to take from here is you're going to see he's going to call Sefer Chashmonaim, he's going to call it by a different name, but he's going to call Sefer Chashmonaim. That's what we want to take here. So just don't get lost in all the names that he's going to be citing over here. He starts off by quoting the Shiltei HaGiborim. The Shiltei HaGiborim, his name was Rabbi Yeshua Boyaz, who lived in the 1500s. And Rabbi Yeshua Boyaz is discussing why Chanukah is 8 days. And says the Shiltei HaGiborim, the reason is because that was the time that the miracle of Chanukah included Chinuch Habayis, re-inaugurating the Beis HaMikdash after the Yevonim removed us from there. And that's a reason, though it's not entirely 100% clear right now, that's somehow a reason for 8 days. Okay. Then he goes on, and he quotes the Shiltei HaGiborim, continues quoting and brings from a Bala Itim. Bala Itim is a much earlier sefer that comes from Sfard, from Barcelona, from a man named Yehuda Barzilai, who lived in the 1000s. And he says, why Chanukah is 8 days, which is an idea I cited before, because 8 days for the fact that the Greeks didn't allow us to do Mila Adkan. So this is Shiltei HaGiborim. Shiltei HaGiborim brought 2 things. One, on his own, the other from the Baal Ha'itim, about these 2 reasons for the 8 days of Chanukah. Comes the Knesset Havdolah, which is Reb Chaim ben Avisti, who lives in Izmir in the 17th century, and he says, Al Karchach, it must be that these 2 sources are explaining the Kasha, the Beis Yosef. The Nes of Nadis was only Shiva, so why do we have 8 days? And on this we have both answers. Says the Knesset Havdolah, the second answer I understand. Mila takes 8 days, I understand the second answer. But what's the first answer? Because of Chinuch? Because of Chinuch of the Beis HaMikdash, that turns into 8? How does that turn into 8? Reb Chaim ben Abisti says, he turns to the Shiltei HaGiborim and he says he doesn't understand. Good. V'ishtamit lei says, now Rabbi Elio Shapiro is talking, he says, the Knesset HaGdolah missed, he forgot about, he didn't realize what it says in Sefer HaMaccabee. What does it say in Sefer HaMaccabee? Shakasav lahedya shachanchu ches yamin. It says clearly over there that the Chanukah Sabayis took 8 days. And that's why it's a very beautiful thing when you say 8 days because of Chanukah Sabayis, because the duration of it was 8 days. How do I know the duration of it was 8 days? Where does it say that the duration of this process to re-inaugurate the Beis HaMikdash was 8 days? The answer is in Sefer HaMaccabee. So Rabbi Elio Shapiro turns to the Knesset HaGdolah and says, you didn't have Sefer HaMaccabee, I have Sefer HaMaccabee, and this is what it says over here, and this is our third hit, and where a Posek brings this book. He calls it Sefer HaMaccabee. These are two different terms. Chazal never used the term Maccabee. When I say Chazal, I mean in the Doira, the Tanoim, and the Amoraim, we don't find the term Maccabee being used. We do find Chazal using the term Chashmonoi, but this book that we're talking about here actually doesn't use the term Chashmonoi. This book that we're calling Sefer Chashmonoi in our first two hits actually uses the term Maccabee again and again. And we're not going to get into today what is the meaning of Chashmonoi, what is the meaning of Maccabee, where do these terms come from. Doesn't matter. For other purposes right now, we know they're referring to the same thing. And finally, the last posek that we are going to discuss today, who brings from this work, is Rabbi Yomtiv Lipman Halevi Heller, the author of the Tosas Yomtiv. He too is in Prague, and so maybe there's something in the water in Prague that is leading these rabbis specifically, because now you have Rabbi Elio Shapiro and the Tosas Yomtiv. He's earlier. We're going back in time. The Tosas Yomtiv passed away in 1654, so now we're in the 17th century. And here we're dealing with the fact that on Chanukah we have, the Mishnah says that what's the Kriyas HaTorah on Chanukah? We read the Nesim from Parshas Nosai. Why? Why do we read the Chanukas, the Karbanis that the Nesim brought when they inaugurated the Beis HaMikdash, when they inaugurated the Mishkan in Parshas Nosai? What's the reason? Zogt the Tosas Yomtiv ben Nesim. The reason we read on Chanukah ben Nesim, Davename Chanukas HaMizbeach, Ken Kosav Rashi v'Aran. Because Rashi and the Ran say it makes so much sense. Because the story of Chanukah is we reclaim the Beis HaMikdash. So that's Chanukas HaMizbeach. So it makes sense to read Chanukas HaMishkan. However, continues the Tosas Yomtiv, Va'atur Siman Tafresh Peidalid does not bring this reason. He brings a different reason. He brings a medrash that says Mishum Shanish La Melechas HaMishkan B'Chafei Kislev, because originally when they were putting up the Mishkan, they actually finished on Chafei Kislev. And Hashem said, you're not going to inaugurate it, you're going to wait all the way to Reish Chodesh Nisan to inaugurate it. So there was this major delay. So in order to remember the fact that really the Mishkan, way back when, was finished on Chafei B'Kislev, so we read the Kriya of the Chanukah Sanasim, which could have been, those Karbanas that the Nesim brought, which happened in Nisan, could have really been in Kislev. So to commemorate that, we read this Kriya on Kislev. Why does the Torah not just say what Rashi says? Why does the Torah not say, what is it? Chanukah Sabayis. The Maccabees came, they took back the Beis HaMikdash, so they re-inaugurated, so read the inauguration. The reason he doesn't do it is because Chazal, if you look, you're not going to find a passage in Chazal that talks about an inauguration. Kamuvin, they took back the Beis HaMikdash, but a passage in Chazal that clearly says that they came back and they made a Chanukah, you don't have. And that's probably why the Torah didn't like this reason that Rashi and Ran said, oh, they came back. Obviously, there was some sort of re-inauguration. Who told you? And so that's why the Torah is giving this other reason. The Torah doesn't say it clearly, but that's what's coming out over here. That's Papashas the Mashmos. So now what happens is, he continues. Rabbi Yontif Lipan Alevi Heller is like bothered by this taka. Like, where do we taka find that they re-inaugurated? They actually made a Chanukah. In other words, the Torah's question, the Torah's silent question, is bothering Rabbi Yontif Lipan Alevi Heller. So what does he do? He writes here as follows: V'ani matzasi b'sefer Maccabee, and I found in the book of Maccabee, shekashvu ha'chashmonaim liyavonim, that when the Chashmonaim prevailed over the Greeks, matzu mizbeach mishukat, they found the mizbeach desecrated, v'sasroi, so they removed it, demolished it, uvanu me'chadash, they rebuilt it, v'chanchu oisai, and they rededicated it b'chafei b'kislev. So we do have a source that says there was an inauguration. Where is that source? It's in Sefer Maccabee. So that justifies what Rashi and the Ran were saying, and so therefore it buttresses them, despite what the Torah's concerns were. We don't need to have the Torah's concerns, because I found in Sefer Maccabee. What's interesting is that the Tosas Yomtiv was printed the first time in the year 1615. That was the first time it was printed in Prague. And over there, this second passage, V'ani Matzasi, and I found in Sefer Maccabee, is not there. It's not there in the first edition. He reissued a second printing in 1643 in Krakow. The Tosfos Yontif later in life moved from Prague and went to Krakow. And that's where he added this paragraph in that second print. It was still when he was alive. Because the Lashon is interesting. He writes and there's V'ani Matzasi. It does sound like a comment that was generated later, and Itaka is not there in the first print. It was there in the second print, which makes you wonder that the Sefer Maccabee was not something that the Tosfos Yontif had access to or had read earlier in his life. It's something he came in contact with a little later, and maybe I'll share some thoughts about that moving on, moving forward. So what's the bottom line? The bottom line in summary right now is we looked at one simple fact. And we found 4 Gedolei Yisrael, Poskim, who are writing Sifrei Halacha, who quote a book. Sometimes they call it Sefer Hashmonai, sometimes they call it Sefer Maccabee. In 2 of them, they're discussing why Chanukah is 8 days. And one of them invokes Sefer Hashmonai to say it's Sukkos. The other one said because the dedication lasted for 8 days. Another one invoked it in order to tell us that the story of Yehudis didn't happen over Chanukah. And another one invoked it to tell us why the Kriyas HaTorah is done on Chanukah in terms of the story of the Nesiim and their Kabbanas. This is in terms of the Poskim. Till now, we're looking at Poskim. But we also have, in the Jewish bookshelf, we also have books of Jewish history. That is, Gedolei Yisrael. At least some of them go in the category of Gedolei Yisrael, some of them maybe don't go in the category of Gedolei Yisrael, but nonetheless, Jews, rabbis, and scholars who wrote books of Jewish history. And as we're going to find, some of them relied on the Sefer Hashmonai. I still didn't tell you what Sefer Hashmonai is, but now I want to turn to the historians. So we're going to turn now to Reb David Gans. Reb David Gans also lives in Prague. That's why it buttresses the theory that there was something in the water there. He passed away in 1613, so we're a little earlier than the Tosfos Yontif. He wrote a history sefer that's called Tzemach David. A very interesting sefer. It's a Jewish history, and it includes elements of world history as well. And he deals over here with Yehudis. And he says that she's an Eshes Chayil Mina Ivriyos, and she was Harga as Sar Tzva Alaparna. She kills the general Holofernes. When did this happen? He says, we don't know the time of this story. However, according to the author of the Piyut, the Yotzer of the first Shabbos of Chanukah, according to him, it happened in the time of the story of Chanukah. Says he, I did not find anything of the sort in Sifrei Hashmonaim. Notice over here, he actually is calling Sefer Hashmonaim in the plural. There's more than one, and that's something we'll talk about soon. But here is an example of something he does dozens of times in his work, dozens of times he invokes Sifrei Hashmonaim. Here, he's doing something very similar to the Yavitz did. In fact, there's every reason to assume that the Yavitz may have seen this passage in the Tzemach David, said, Yehuda's story can't be a Chanukah story because Sefer Hashmonaim doesn't say anything of this sort. Reb David Gans goes on to say that Sefer Yehudis, if you read the text of Sefer Yehudis, we'll talk more about where this text comes from soon. If you read the text, you'll see either it happened in the days of Nebuchadnezzar, or it happened in the days of a king named Cambyses, who's the son of Cyrus, the Persian period, which is that period between Churban Bayis Rishon and the second Beis HaMikdash. Nonetheless, he goes on to say, maybe the Chachamim decided it's a good idea to create a commemoration and to append it to Chanukah, similar to what the Yavitz had said. Then he goes on to say that really this idea, this problem, and this solution is not his own. He got it from somewhere else. Where did he get it from? He goes on to say, V'ayim b'Sefer Ma'or Enayim, Perek Non Aleph. See the Sefer Ma'or Enayim, chapter 51. What's Sefer Ma'or Enayim? We're referring here to a Sefer that was written by a man named Rebbe Azariah. This is a very controversial Sefer in Jewish history. Rebbe Azariah is known as Rebbe Azariah Min HaAdumim. His Italian last name was De Rosi. He lived in the 1500s in Mantua in Italy, and he printed a sefer called Ma'or Enayim, which one section of which is a Jewish history sefer, and he printed this in 1574. there were many rabbis that came out against this sefer in the years after it was published. What was the problem with this sefer? To me, it appears it was much more about style than substance. And I'll give you just a quick example. There's a Gemara that discusses how Titus died. Gemara in Titus, how a Gemara in Gittin, how a mosquito entered his brain. So what he does is, he says, well, I read Roman works and Roman history, and I don't see that that's how Titus died. And so therefore, and then his language becomes like, well, Chazal were... Now, there's a way of doing this. In other words, he could have said, well, sometimes the Rambam said that sometimes Chazal, they spoke in metaphors. Right? There is a track within legitimate Judaism to do that. And there's a certain way that these things are said and not said. But I don't recall the exact Lashonis that he used, but he basically says things that make it sound like, oh, it's a fairy tale, and we shouldn't take this seriously at all. So this enraged many Rabbanim. The Maharal of Prague wrote a sefer, a large portion of which is bashing the Ma'oranaim. There was a cherem that was put out Rabbanim in Eretz Yisrael about this in the 1500s. Nonetheless, it happens to be a very useful sefer because he discusses a lot of elements of Jewish history, and anyone who's interested in Jewish history needs to use the sefer. So Tzemach David needed to use the sefer, and anyone else who's interested in Jewish history needs to use the sefer. And Sefer Ma'oranaim, number one, quotes Sefer Chashmonaim very often. Number one. And number two, he's the one who says, hey, Yehudis, that doesn't work out because Yehudis it's not a Chanukah story. And he goes on to say, well, maybe they wanted to create a day, so they appended it to Chanukah. So this idea that we actually saw we saw it in the Yavitz, has roots in the Tzemach David. Tzemach David himself is telling you it comes from the Ma'oranaim. Okay, this is an example. The reason I'm showing this to you is this is an example of history svarim that are dealing with the Sifrei Chashmonaim. Number one, I showed this to you in Tzemach David. Number two, I showed this to you in this controversial Sefer Ma'oranaim. However, if we go back earlier, we see that there's another work of Jewish history that also seems to have relied on Sefer Chashmonaim, and that brings us to the book of Yosifun. So what is the story of Yosifun? We saw before that the Yavitz quoted Yosifun. We can spend a lot of time on this. We're just going to do this very, very briefly right now. During the last generation of the second Beis HaMikdash, there was a Yid in Eretz Yisrael whose name was Yosef ben Matisyahu. He was a Kohen. And after the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, he moved to Rome, and he wrote in Greek 4 books that relate to Jewish life and Jewish history. One of them, which I have here right now, is called Josephus, the Jewish War. This is a translation into English of now what's the main story he's telling here? He's telling here the story of the revolt of the Jews against Rome that culminated in the Churban Beis HaMikdash. This is where he says the story of Metzara is toward the end of this book, the Jewish War. The beginning of this book, the Jewish War, where does he start? He starts with the story of Chanukah. This is the Jewish War. Now, no, he lived way after the story of Chanukah. He lived well after, but he had sources. We'll talk about that soon. He also wrote another work that was called Antiquities of the Jews that also has been translated into many languages. Again, he writes it in Greek. That one begins with Adam and goes down, says the story of the Jews down to his day. Now, the Rishonim, many of the Rishonim quote Yosifun. Many of the Rishonim do this. Rashi and many of the other Rishonim quote a work called Yosifun. Without going too much into it, apparently there was a Jewish writer who wrote a Hebrew version of this and the other work of Antiquities, wrote a Hebrew version of this, which the Rishonim used and took it very, very seriously. You can do an entire topic on who used the Sefer Yosifun and how and why and what, if there are hesitations, and what are they. But this is a Sefer that many of them used, and indeed in this volume you have also the story of Chanukah in here. When was this done? The assumption is sometime like the 800s or the 900s, I don't remember right now, is when this Hebrew version was made. If you open Yosifun Parakavav, that is this Hebrew version, you read the last few lines, he's finishing off over here to say the story of Shimon HaMaccabee, which means as follows. The first Maccabee After Matisyahu, the leader is Yehuda. After Yehuda dies, the leader is Yonasan. After Yonasan dies, is Shimon. And Shimon is the one who really establishes the Hashmonai monarchy. After he dies, his son takes over. Yosifun signs off Perek Chavav by saying, V'yeser dvarav u'milchamosav u'milchamesachav. The rest of his story of Shimon and of his brothers' wars. Halohen ksuvim al sefer Yosef ben Gurion HaKohen. It's written in the book of Yosef ben Gurion HaKohen. It's written in the book of Josephus. He refers to him as Yosef ben Gurion HaKohen. Ve'al sefer HaChashmonaim. It's also in Sefer HaChashmonaim. Presumably, this is the same Chashmonaim that we're referring to. Ve'al sifrei Malchei Roma, and in Roman history. So the author of Yosifun is essentially saying, you want more to the story, you could go back to the original Josephus, you could go back to the Books of Maccabees, because the Books of Maccabees, which the author of Yosifun was aware of, has more of the story. And indeed, there's every reason to assume and believe that Josephus himself, when he wrote after the Churban Bayis, what sources was he basing himself on? He was basing himself on this Book of Maccabees that we are talking about. So what do you have here? You have another example of a historian that cites Sefer HaShmonaim. In this case, not Reb David Gans and the Moranim were writing in the 1500s and the 1600s. We're going way back to Yosifun. Yosifun also citing this concept of Sefer HaShmonaim as a source if you want to know the story of Chanukah. Okay, so what is the Sefer HaShmonaim? There was a Christian cleric who translated the Tanakh into Latin. His name was Jerome. He was in Eretz Yisrael in the Tkufa of Amoraim, in the 300s. He was in Eretz Yisrael, and he writes that sometimes he needed help. He would talk to Jews who would help explain to him difficult passages in Tanakh. He writes in his Hakdama, in his introduction to Sefer Shmuel, he writes about the Books of Maccabees. He says there are two books of Maccabees that are in existence. The first one was written in Hebrew, he tells us, and the second one was written in Greek. There is no Hebrew book of Maccabees today, which means that it was once in Hebrew, based on his testimony, it was once in Hebrew, and indeed when you read it, it sounds like written in a Hebrew style. It was once in Hebrew, but the Hebrew was eventually lost, and the only thing that survived was the Greek translation. When Tanakh was translated into Greek, I mentioned before a Latin translation. Now let's go back. When it was translated in this period of the second Beis HaMikdash, when it was translated into Greek, in addition to translating the Tanakh, there were additional works by Jews that were circulating during this period that are not part of Tanakh and that are not part of the Jewish bookshelf for that matter. And they were circulating. And these two were translated into Greek. Presumably Jews who were Greek speakers wanted to have a Greek translation of these works. And they were around. And what happened was that when Christians came and took the Bible, they had to also think about, are they taking these other works as well? And the Catholics eventually made a decision that they are, and that this is going to become a section in their Bible. And so they have what they call the Old Testament, they have what they call the New, and they have a section that's called Apocrypha. Apocrypha is a Greek word that means buried away, hidden away. And the reason it's called buried or hidden away is because these books were not official books in terms of the Jewish community, and so therefore they were buried away, but they decided that they're keeping it, and so you have this very odd reality in history that were it not for the church, these books would have been lost. The church is the ones who preserved them. Not all of Christianity accepts it. There's different denominations. Some of them are against it, but the Catholic Church had accepted it and kept it amongst them. And so from Greek, it eventually was translated by someone into Latin, and that's how it came down to us today. Amongst these books is numerous of these books, and amongst them is two books of Maccabees that Jerome mentioned. Again, the first was written in Hebrew, and the second was written in Greek. These were written soon after the story of Chanukah, and they tell the story. Each one, there's overlap between them, but there's also differences between them. We'll talk more about the differences in a few minutes, but also in terms of the timeline, they don't cover the same amount of time. The first book of Maccabees goes all the way till Shimon passed away, and the Malucha transferred to his son, and that's where it ends. Whereas the second, what's known as the second book of Maccabees, or second Maccabees, it concludes the story after the death of Yehuda Maccabee, if I recall correctly. Which now raises a question. Well, presumably these books were written by Jews, so why did they get lost? Why didn't they remain on the Jewish bookshelf? We understand that it's not going to be part of Tanakh. Tanakh is written through Nevuah. And there's no Nevuah in this period of time. And so we understand that it's not going to be part of Tanakh, but you can still be a book. So why is it that these books fell off of the Jewish bookshelf? So there are two possible explanations for this. One explanation for this, I'm going to introduce by going back to Reb David Gans. Reb David Gans, he's the author of the Tzemach David. I showed you before. He quotes the Sefer Chashmonaim. So he has another book that's a work of astronomy that's called Nechmad V'Noim. And in his Hakdama to his work on astronomy, Nechmad V'Noim, he quotes one of these apocryphal works that's known as Chachmas Shloima. Interestingly, he points out that the Ramban, in Ramban's introduction to Pirush HaTorah, Ramban quotes this apocryphal work from Chachmas Shloima. I don't remember what the idea was over there, but he says the Ramban quotes it. So he notices the fact that the Ramban quotes it, and he says, by the way, the book Chachmas Shloima, you can't rely on it. Likewise, all of these books that are apocryphal, you can't rely on them. Why? Because they're not part of our Messiah. Who knows what happened to the text? A text that's part of the Jewish community, we guard it. Here, it wasn't part of the Jewish community for centuries. How do you know what happened to this text? Maybe they introduced change, they take in a verse, take out a verse, you never really know. And so therefore, we can't rely on these texts. Now what I found interesting in what he's saying is, there's an underlying assumption in Reb David Gans's text. The underlying assumption is, originally these books were fine. When he needs to cite a problem, what is his problem? His problem was there was no hashgacha. There was a problem in the transmission where we weren't guarding these in generation after generation. That's where there's a problem. He could have said, oh, these were written by people who didn't know what they were talking about. There's erroneous ideas over there. He didn't assume that there were erroneous ideas, so he tells you not to rely on it. Why? Because of the transmission factor, which then raises the question, well, if there aren't erroneous ideas in there, then why did it fall off of the Jewish bookshelf? That becomes a very valid and an important question. So he doesn't answer that question, but I'll tell you a very simple explanation that this was said by Avram Kahana. Avram Kahana, in 1937, printed 2 volumes called Svarim Achitzonim, the outside works. This is volume 2. He published this in 1937. What he did is he took all the works from the Apocrypha, which don't exist in Hebrew, although in the Cairo Geniza, years later, by then, a few fragments of one of these works were found in the Cairo Geniza, and then later in Israel, in a few places, they found a few fragments in Hebrew of some of this material. But for the most part, there's no Hebrew remaining of any of this. He translated back from the Greek into the Hebrew with an introduction for each one. So the 2 books of Maccabees are in volume 2 of this work known as Hasvarim HaChitzonim. So in his introduction, he suggests something very simple. He says, Jewish history is full of events where there's a knock at the door and says, we got to get out of town because the Cossacks are coming. Whoever the Cossacks were in a given century. You have 10 minutes to pack your stuff. What are you taking with you? So obviously you're going to take your gold, your silver. You're also going to take your Tanakh, the Torah, the thing that's most important to you. What are you going to do with the book of Maccabees that's lying there on the shelf? You're not taking it. Why? It's not sacred. It's interesting. It's informative. Very nice. But when you're running, you're not taking it with you. So his theory is that you have a good book, but it's not a holy book. It's not a holy book. You don't have Mesiras Nefesh to preserve it. You don't have Mesiras Nefesh to preserve it. It gets lost. Okay, that fits well with David Gans, who then says, once it gets lost, you got to be careful. Why? Because we don't know. It wasn't part of our Mitzvah, so you don't know. You don't know what you're reading, so you need to be really, really careful about it. This is one way of thinking about what happened to these books. However, there's another way of thinking about what happened to these books, and this is introduced by a man named Maharatz Chayes, or Tzvi Hirsch Chayes. He is one of the rabbis in Central Europe in the 19th century. He passed away in 1855. He had a relationship with the Chassam Sofer, a very interesting man. So he has a book called Toras and Nevi'im. And in Toras and Nevi'im, he says, by the way, in Bayesheni, we had other books. They were written by Jews. For example, Sefer Chashmonaim. Then he goes on and says, Yafa asu Chazal. Chazal did good. Did da'achu hasvarim alalu b'shtei yadayim, that they rejected these books. So this is different. he's talking about not that they somehow fizzled out without anyone realizing. No, there was an active rejection of these books by Chazal according to him. It didn't get added to the Jewish bookshelf. Why? Because they're inconsistent with the Seder HaKabbalah, Amitis Kefisha Masa Alonu Medar, because these books are inconsistent with normative Judaism. What's his example? He says, I'll give you an example. And his first example, he brings a numerous example, but his first example is from 2 Maccabees. 2 Maccabees goes back in time. And it says a Maisa that happened when they rebuilt the second Beis HaMikdash. When they rebuilt the second Beis HaMikdash, Nehemiah sent the Kohanim to find fire. This is the story. That by the Churban of the first Beis HaMikdash, they took the fire to the Mizbech and they hid it somewhere. That it should be kindled for the duration of the Galus, and somehow the fire survives. Nehemiah says, go find that fire so we can restart the second Beis HaMikdash Mizbeach. They go, they can't find the fire. What they find is some congealed liquid. That's in that location. A mayim kfuim they find over there. Well, Nehemiah says, bring it over anyway. And they bring it, they put a carbon on the Mizbeach, they take this congealed water, they put it on top, the clouds move, the sun shines, and all of a sudden, a fire comes down from heaven and consumes the carbon. This is the story that we don't have in other sources. 2 Maccabees, going back in time, says this story about the period of Nehemiah, beginning of the second Beis HaMikdash. Says Maratz Chayes, that's inconsistent with what Chazal tell us. Chazal tell us that in the second Beis HaMikdash there was no eish that was yored min hashamayim to consume the carbon. In the first Beis HaMikdash you had it, in the second Beis HaMikdash you don't. And even though the Gemara says that maybe there was an eish in the second Beis HaMikdash, but it's very clear, the Gemara in Yuma, that it didn't consume the carbon. And here you have it is consuming the carbon. So it's not consistent. So if you're not consistent, so out. So the second Chazal saw it, the second Jew who was a Yerei Shamayim, who was in step with what Chazal wanted, would have rejected this type of work and wouldn't have wanted it. Then he said, well, maybe you could salvage it. You could say that that was for the period of Bayis Sheni overall. Maybe the first few days they still had this Maisa. So maybe it's not such a problem. Okay, but the truth is that if you go a little bit beyond what Maratz Chayes is talking about over here, and you look at the Book of Maccabees more closely, and especially what we're lucky is you have two. You have first and second. And what that does to you is you're able to say, well, here's two different voices telling at parts the same story. And that compare and contrast is actually valuable because it highlights what each one is interested in and what they're talking about. And what happens is, and when you read First Maccabees, and then you read Second, you notice that there's certain things First Maccabees actually is consistently avoiding. What are those things? Here's a partial list. First Maccabees barely talks about God. First Maccabees barely talks about Hashgacha. The idea of everything is providence and that Hashem is in control of everything is not a major theme at all in the first book of Maccabees. Midah keneged midah. The idea that if you do something wrong, you're going to get tit for tat, that type of idea is also absent, which very often is associated with the concept of Hashgacha Pratis. Prayer is very much muted in First Maccabees. You have the first 4 chapters, it's mentioned a few times, of raising their voices to the Shamayim, but after the 4th chapter, there's no more prayer. The concept that the suffering of the Jews was because of their sins, and this is God's way of getting them to do teshuvah, is absent in First Maccabees. The concept of Mesiras Nefesh being a good thing, a noble thing, is absent from First Maccabees. Tchias HaMesim is absent from First Maccabees, and Nisim, miracles, all miracles, are removed from this work. You probably wouldn't notice it, but then when you read Second Maccabees and you see all of these things are very much stressed in Second Maccabees, the one that was written in Greek. God, Hashgacha Pratis, Midah keneged midah, this prayer galore. All of the suffering Jews were experiencing was because of their sins, and this is God's way of getting them to repent. Mesiras Nefesh, the story, Chana v'Shiva Baneha, and all of that, which you have in Second Maccabees. Tchias HaMesim is a major theme. Miracles is a major theme. So we come to Maratz Chayes and we say, okay, you focused on one Gemara in Yuma. But you could, if you want to go with your Mahalech, there's probably a better Mahalech right here. That's to look at this. It doesn't turn the work, in my view, into a work of kfira. You read the work, it's a nice work. You read the book, you're not going to find, oh, what a terrible passage. All these things that I'm saying are more a mission than like a problematic passage. But what it does show you, and that it does tell you, and what it does remind you is that it's written by a specific person in a specific time for a very specific agenda. And what was the agenda? It's very clear. It's to explain that you need to have Hashmonai kings. They're good. You want to have Hashmonai kings. You don't want to have Gentile kings. And Hashmonaim are very, very good and worthy people to lead the Jewish people. That's essentially what the motive of this author was. And because of that, he pushed the keys that was relevant for that. The motive of the author of Second Maccabees is more difficult to put a finger on it, but I will say that one of the challenges from, I think, a Chazal perspective with this is, it's full of these miracles with like, if these miracles really happen, then it would behoove us to commemorate them and to talk about them. You can't be an ingrate by experiencing all these miracles, and because Second Maccabees is full of these things, angels coming down from heaven, swords coming down, like a lot of stuff. And if Chazal didn't tell us to commemorate that, so that turns into a little bit of a problem for this type of work. So I'm using the Maratz Chayes' idea that it's not just that by accident, because the Cossacks were coming, so they weren't preserved, but that there were Jews who said, it was written very nice by someone, but it's not so important, it's not so necessary. And so a Jew who wanted to have a Jewish bookshelf, inspired by the teachings of Chazal, maybe wasn't too thrilled to have these particular books. And that's another way, that's more in line with the Maratz Chayes' way of explaining how they get lost to Jewish history. But nonetheless, we already showed you that there were a number of poskim that referred to it. And the historians of Tzemach David and the Ma'aranayim and even Yosifun also referred to it and used it. But we find, this part I found particularly interesting, direct Jewish attempt during the Middle Ages to access this book and to use it, even though they didn't really have that opportunity. Why is that? When is the first time this book is translated into Hebrew? I mentioned before, Kahana's 1937 translation over here. It was done for the first time in 1830. There was someone who published in 1830, he took the Books of Maccabees and he translated into Hebrew. So from 1830, anyone who wanted to read these books in Hebrew, they had that ability to do that. Presumably the Aruch HaShulchan would have had a copy, he would have read it, etc. However, even before 1830, there was access to the Jewish community. What was access to the Jewish community? In the 1600s and in the 1700s, there were books that were printed in Europe. I have a Prague 1625 that I was able to see. That's Sefer Yudah HaMaccabi in Yiddish. It's a Yiddish translation or reworking of the Book of Maccabees. And by the way, it was printed in Prague. And let me remind you, I said before, there was something in the water in Prague. And it's very possible that they were reading this Yiddish translation that was printed in 1625 or earlier. The Teisos Yontif and Eliyahu Rabbah, etc. So you have the Hebrew 1830. You have 200 years earlier. You have this Yiddish version, which has it's in the Yudah Maccabi Yud Vav Dalet Aleph Maccabi is the way the title page was printed. But if you go back earlier, you actually find there's a few manuscripts of Jews who wrote the Sefer, a translation of the Sefer Maccabi in their own notebooks. And these manuscripts have survived, which is evidence of this attempt to say, I want to have direct access to it, not just through the Yosifun, which gives you a lot of that information, but to have more like direct access to the Book of Maccabees. There's one very interesting manuscript that does this, which is known as Paris number 585. I was debating to bring the picture in, I decided not to bring the picture in. This is a miscellany, which means it's a booklet that starts with a collection of tshuvas of the Goinim and the Rishonim of Svart. Then he has Yosifun written out over there. And then he has Sefer HaKabbalah L'Ravid, another important history sefer that we're not going to talk about right now. And we know that this writing, all the way at the end of the book, and then at the end he has a story of Yehuda Maccabi. And clearly this is a Hebrew translation of the Books of Maccabees, and then what we're lucky is that we get a colophon at the end. And he writes about when he's writing, where he's writing, and why he's writing this. So let's read this colophon together That's in the back of this manuscript. Ani HaKosev, I the writer, Kasafti Kol Zeh Ha'inyan, I wrote all of this, Bechan here, Foix. Foix today is in southwest France, but it's very, very close to the border in Italy, and this time it's associated with Italian, with the Italian region. So I wrote this there, Bishnas Chameshes Alafim U'Masayim 5202 Liyitzira, that is 1442. So I wrote this in 1442. How did I get this book of Maccabees? Mipi Goy Chacham Echad, from a non-Jewish scholar. Shamatzui Kasuv B'Sefer Echad Misifrei Atos, he found this in one of the erroneous books. Erroneous books means in a Christian Bible. V'koydin heim l'sefer, they call this book Libru Misal. Missal is an English word, I learned it today. Apparently some Christian liturgical thing. M-I-S-S-A-L. Okay. Libro is a book. Libru Misal is a liturgical book. So they call this book liturgical book, and they have over there this. Vagoya. Now, I don't, presumably this is written in Latin. Me, the Jew, I don't know Latin. So the Gentile basically read the text by translating it to me in Italian. And I wrote it down into Hebrew. The Christians call this book Historia Dilush Maccabush. The history, Historia Dilush of Maccabush, the Maccabees. They call it the Book of Maccabees. I said before that in the Books of Maccabees, it doesn't refer to Chashmonaim. That's Chazal use that term. Josephus also used the term Chashmonaim, by the way. But these books have the term Maccabees. So, Historia of the Maccabees, Al Shem Yehuda Maccabee, Am Niskar. Now, who's Yehuda Maccabee? You say, we all know Yehuda Maccabee. Chazal don't talk about Yehuda Maccabee. How do you know Yehuda Maccabee? So he's in the Books of Maccabees, but he's like, but I'm writing to someone who doesn't know the Book of Maccabees. Where are you going to know him from? And this is going to make things a little more confusing right now. You're going to know him from something called Megillas Matisya ben Yochanan. A Megillah Matisya ben Yochanan. The Go'onim and some of the Rishonim spoke about something called Megillas Antiochus. It's very short. I have it right over here. It begins, Vayhi b'mei Antiochus Melech Yavan. There was a custom in some communities to read it, including in Italy. In Italy, there was a custom to read it. It goes here 4 or 5 pages. Okay, so this existed from the times of the Go'onim and the Rishonim. It mentions Yehuda Maccabee there, so he's telling the person who's going to read his Kolofin, Yehuda Maccabee, yeah, you know him from, we're in Italy, you know him from this thing known as Megillas Antiochus. Because I saw in the Books of Maccabees God's greatness, and the miracles Yisrael, against the Greeks and the Gentiles. I didn't find this in any of the 24 biblical books. I don't find any heresy in this book. Right? There is no, I mentioned before, you're not going to find a problematic passage you point to as you go, I cringe. A loyal Jew wouldn't find that. It's more, the things that I spoke about before are more bigger picture in contrast to Second Maccabees. So therefore, Allah al-Daiti, I decided lahatikoi, to copy it down, kedei l'saper l'kel yavai, for all future people to know Gvuras Hashem, the greatness of Hashem. V'im kol zeh, nonetheless, I didn't add it like, I have a Tanakh. I have a manuscript Tanakh. I didn't add it there. I don't think it belongs together with the Tanakh. Remember here, it comes after a few history works and a few tshuvas from Go'inim. Then he goes on to say the following. Even though maybe there's an argument to say that it's a good book. Why? Because I heard from a rabbi that this whole story of the Book of Maccabees, he's only here working with First Maccabees. The whole thing of First Maccabees was Kasuv b'Megillas, was written in Megillas, and this is a right-hand page, and the left-hand page isn't there. So we don't know what he said, but I think we know. I think we could guess what he says. I heard from a rabbi who said that really all of this was once in Megillas Antiochus, this work that again the Go'inim and the Rishonim mentioned, which I said is only 5 pages, very short. So some rabbi probably told him that all of that was once part of Megillas Antiochus, but then somehow Megillas Antiochus got shortened, and I assume that's what happened. But I don't know, does he go on for 1 line? Does he go on for 10 lines? There's no real way to know. This is one of those mysteries. The next page is gone. Here you see a Jew in the 1400s who wants to have direct access to the Book of Maccabees. He learns about it in a very interesting way, and he does this very hard work of hearing from the Latin into the Italian, copying it down, writing it down. He's not the only one. There's another older manuscript from a few hundred years before, also in the library in Paris, that has a similar difference. Someone else who did their Hebrew translation. Okay. We're going to have to skip the next section due to the lack of time. And we're going to conclude now. Someone asked before, what about the Rebbe? Did the Rebbe use these books of Maccabees? So the answer is a few times yes. Let's go to the Farbrengen of Shabbos Parshas Miketz Tav Shel Lamed Vav. The Rebbe here was talking about the connection between Chanukah and Sukkot. There is a connection between Chanukah and Sukkot. You see clearly in the Gemara. Beis Shammai says, how do we light the menorah? We go from 8 to 7 to 6 to 5 to 4. Peiches v'hoilich. Why peiches v'hoilich? Keneged parei achag. Keneged parei achag. Ma kesher Sukkot. Why? Because the karbanis that you brought on Sukkot, there are more animals on the first day, and then we're peiches v'hoilich. But this is a shita of Beis Shammai. So the Rebbe says, what do you see from here? You see from here that there's a connection between Sukkot and Chanukah. After that, the Rebbe says, Al derech zeh bringt sich euch herab in Sefer Hashmonaim die Sheiches von Chanukah to Sukkot. Also in the book of Hashmonaim, Books of Maccabees, it speaks about the link between Chanukah and Sukkot. That's the passage we started with. Remember what the Aruch HaShulchan said? Aruch HaShulchan said, why 8 days? Because they wanted to recreate their missed Sukkot that they had then. So that demonstrates for another way. There's a connection between Chanukah and Sukkot. Now this is Hanacha Bilti Muga. It's not entirely clear. It's a Shabbos Farbrengen. So I don't know if they fully captured exactly what the Rebbe was trying to say, but apparently the Rebbe was saying, therefore, there's a reason to have extra Simcha on Chanukah. Sukkot is all the time of V'samachta b'chagecha. So because of the link between Chanukah and Sukkot, it's demonstrated through Chazal, Beis Shammai, and secondly through the book of Maccabees, there's a reason to have, I think, that's the content, there's a reason to be extra b'simcha, because the Rebbe said this on a Shabbos Chanukah. But then, after bringing the book of Maccabees, the Rebbe says, second Maccabees, it's not cited in the Gemara or in Chassidus. I don't want to take the responsibility of citing it and invoking it and relying upon it. However, on the other hand, says Mernit, as divas veisen, as versteht those who know what it says there, darfen say das Eisnutzen in an Eifem von Kol Masacha Yil L'Shem Shemaim, you have to use it in a positive way. So I happen to know that it says there, and so therefore I'm using a L'Shem Shemaim. How am I using a L'Shem Shemaim? By buttressing the Beis Shammai argument that there's a link, and again, if the message is more Simcha and Chanukah, then all the better. It works out. It's a positive thing. And so therefore, I'm going to go ahead and do this. The Rebbe cited this work 2 or 3 or 4 other times. Sometimes in Likutei Sichos, when the Rebbe wants to say the story of Chanukah, the Sich in Chelik Lamed, just says Kimesupar b'divrei hayamim, as it says it without any citation. Sometimes the Rebbe points in a footnote and says Sefer Hashmonaim, but with some hesitation about whether we should be quoting this Sefer. This happens a few times. So what's the takeaway from all this? The takeaway from all this is as follows. When it comes to learning about the details of the story of Chanukah, and I'm talking about the details, the entire persecution of the Greeks, and the revolt of the Hashmonaim, and who did what and when, and all of that, ultimately, we're pretty much limited, where Chazal say very, very little. Very, very little. So if you want to put a full story together, your two avenues are first and second Maccabees. And one of the things I tried conveying is that those are very limited in terms of what they're able to give you because of the biases that these authors had. Which means, ultimately, and this sometimes happens, sometimes there's going to be unknowns. And a lot about the story of Chanukah is therefore unknown. This is the best we have, is these particular works. Throughout the generations, did this bother our ancestors? No. Why didn't it bother our ancestors? Because our ancestors weren't so concerned about the exact dates and timeline of the persecution and the revolt. Chanukah, what was important was that there is an important message, 2, 3, 4, 5 messages that is relevant for Jews, a religious message for Chanukah, and that's what they ran with, and that's what they thought about Chanukah, and that's what the Lichtalach der Tzelin is, those stories. And that was what's important, and that's what the rabbis spoke about, and that's what the Chassidim Farbrengt about, was those stories of Lashkichim Tarasecha Lavir Rechuka Tzanacha, and all that revolves around that. That was what was important. So the specific history, the fact that you needed to look through, or that firstly, for most history, they didn't have access to these sources. And even when you do have them, you realize you're looking into the story through them, with all the limitations that entails. I think the average God-fearing Jew isn't really too much bothered by that. Not being clear on what the message of Chanukah, that's a problem. Not being clear on the exact timeline of Chanukah, less so. And I think what we're also seeing in these sources is essentially viewer discretion advised. And that is, these things exist. They can be used. Many Gedolei Yisrael invoked it, cited it to justify minhagim, to explain things, as we saw the Rebbe's doing that as well. But it almost always, definitely with the Rebbe, it always comes with a but, with a qualification. But other Gedolei Yisrael as well, you see some sort of hesitation. And so another way of saying this is, we cannot have any doubts about our future. And the religious message is about the future, and there is no doubt about the future. About the past, I think we have to be okay with the fact that there's some elements of the story of Chanukah that the past is going to be a little obscured, and that's going to be okay, and that's going to be fine. All right.